Hello APUSH students. In this exam review video, I'm going to do an overview of the parts of women's history that is most pertinent to APUSH. The review and information will be delivered in 4 ways. First, start off with some need-to-know famous women, and then some of the information will come right from the College Board's key concepts, and others will be important to know terms and topics. Okay, let's go. Starting off, let's see how many of these important women you can identify. Here's the first one. You know her? That is right, it is Anne Hutchinson, the famous Puritan preacher exiled from Massachusetts Bay because of her covenant of grace preaching did not jive with Winthrop's covenant of good works. Okay, next. Yes, that is the very famous Sacagawea who helped guide the Lewis and Clark expedition. Moving along. That is Sojourner Truth, a major periods 4 and 5 figure in the women's suffrage and abolitionist movements. Okay, next. This one might be a little tough. It's Susan B. Anthony, champion of temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, and equal pay for equal work. All right, how about this one? This memorable lady is Carrie Nation, most known for her ardent support of temperance and prohibition, using her hatchet to break barrels of alcohol. Bottom left now. You got this one, right? Alice Paul, one of the many leaders of the women's suffrage movement. This next one I'm sure everyone will get. Yes, of course, it's Rosie the Riveter, the famous World War II poster urging women to join the workforce and help the war effort. Okay, second to last might be a tough one. That is Dolores Huerta. She was a labor and civil rights activist and co-founded the National Farm Workers Association. And finally, we have the infamous Phyllis Schlafly, who worked against the Equal Rights Amendment with the argument that it would hurt laws that are meant to protect women. Starting out with Period 1 in gender roles, College Board Key Concept 1.2 says, in their interactions, Europeans and Native Americans asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. Let's take a look at some specific examples of the divergent gender roles. With Native Americans, there are many different cultures, some of which are very different from Europeans, some not so different. Iroquois groups had a matrilineal society, and women held power within their social political structure. Some of the hunter-gatherer groups and tribes on the Great Plains and Caribbean islands had very egalitarian societies without clear ingrained gender roles. Then there were the more organized societies, like the Aztecs. They had a patriarchal society, similar to European cultures. Speaking of which, European societies were very patriarchal, which meant that women had little to none legal rights, or property rights. Period 2 saw some small and temporary changes in the British colonies. In Jamestown, during the early years, women had a greater amount of freedom and property rights due to the high death rate and few women in the colony. In Puritan Massachusetts Bay, their societies were organized around the strict Puritan version of Christianity. This did mean, though, that literacy rates were high amongst women, and they participated in church activities, including Bible discussion. One particular Puritan woman is of importance for us in APUSH, Anne Hutchinson, who gained prominence and a small following with her covenant of grace teachings. However, she was put on trial for heresy and expelled. Moving on to Period 3, we need to evaluate how the Revolution impacted women. First, women participated in the Revolution in various ways. The Daughters of Liberty were a radical patriot group. They aided their fellow disgruntled colonists, the Sons of Liberty, in protesting and boycotting various acts like the Stamp and Townshend. Later on during the Revolutionary War, patriot women helped the effort in various ways. One specific example was the organization of spinning bees to provide clothing for the soldiers. While founding fathers like Jefferson and Adams made great statements about rights and freedoms, they were reluctant or did not see the connection from colonial rights and women's rights. However, some women did. Most notably John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, who wrote to her husband to remember the ladies when setting down the foundations of this new country. However, the ladies will largely be forgotten. Moving on to some need-to-know key terms that are present throughout U.S. history. First are separate spheres and cult of domesticity, which are really one and the same. They are the dominant gender theory for much of U.S. history. With separate spheres, the idea is that men have their places and activities, and women have different ones. For men, their places are politics, work outside the home, the tavern having drinks with their mates, and higher education like college. For women, it is the old trope of staying at home cooking, spinning, cleaning, and taking care of the kids. The cult of domesticity specifies a few distinct attributes that would define a good and virtuous woman. The first is piety, in that they should be the religious center of their home, teaching their children from the Bible. Next is purity, which is to remain a virgin until marriage. Then we have submission, which is being obedient as a child to their parents and as a wife to her husband. The argument is that God appointed men to the superior position, The last one goes back to a woman's sphere, and that is domesticity, which would be keeping a tidy and clean home, along with solid cooking skills. The last key term is Republican motherhood, which is influenced by the Revolution. It is the belief that the daughters of American patriots should be raised to uphold the ideals of republicanism, which is more in the sense of liberty and equality. This ideal puts women in the position that they need to be educated for the primary reason of educating their sons to be good and informed democratic citizens in this new country and society. This is somewhat of an increase in status for women, as they are looked at as having an essential democratic role, and does lead to some educational opportunities. However, it does fall far short of any real legal changes or advancements. Moving on to Period 4, Key Concept 4.2 states that increasing numbers of Americans, especially women and men, working in factories, no longer relied on semi-subsistence agriculture. Instead, they supported themselves producing goods for distant markets. A great example of this are the Lowell Mill girls, who worked at textile mills in the burgeoning market revolution. This provided income for themselves and their families, along with a sense of independence. Staying with Period 4 in Key Concept 4.2, it states that gender and family roles changed in response to the market revolution, particularly with the growth of definitions of domestic ideals that emphasize the separation of public and private spheres. The market revolution is creating both a worker and management class, and we start to see the publications aimed at women and focused on the traditional women's sphere. A key term and topic of Period 4 is the Second Great Awakening. Women took prominent roles in both religious movement and reform efforts that sprouted from it. On the religious aspect, an example is the leader of the Shakers, Anne Lee, who gathered a significant amount of followers who believed in the imminent arrival of Jesus. For the reformer aspect, there are many examples. We'll just highlight two of them here, which are Dorothea Dix and her advocacy for more humane treatment of the mentally ill, and Sojourner Truth, who was a figure in both the women's suffrage and abolitionist movements. Okay, back to key concepts, but still in Period 4. Key Concept 4.1 highlights the very important kickoff to the women's rights and suffrage movement at Seneca Falls. There were 150 plus attendees gathered to create the Declaration of Sentiments document that mirrored in style and format the Declaration of Independence. They sought to create greater equality and opportunities for women. Now in Period 5, Key Concept 5.3 states Reconstruction in the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationships between the states and the federal government, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. The next slide is going to continue with this concept, as the women's rights movement was both emboldened and divided over the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So the Reconstruction Amendments did not include rights based on sex. Women's suffrage supporters were particularly upset with the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for all men regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity, but it made no mention of gender. However, as we will see, the fight for suffrage would continue and pick up steam in the following decades. Now we're in Period 6, or the late 1800s. The growing middle class saw educated women like Jane Addams working to help solve societal issues. She helped to found settlement or hull houses that helped immigrants adapt to U.S. language and customs. These hull houses became important resources for immigrants. Sticking with Key Concept 6.3, many women sought greater equality with men, often joining voluntary organizations, going to college, and promoting social and political reform. Some great examples of this include the social reform groups and reformers, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and national figure Carrie Nation. A political reform example is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with many great leaders, including the strident Alice Paul. Moving on into Period 7, those previously mentioned reform movements and reformers pick up steam in the Progressive era, which will result in the achievement of some of their goals. More and more college-educated women took leading roles in the social gospel and progressive movements. Divorce rates also rose as some women left their traditional roles to be more active in social movements. Also, constrictive clothing personified in Gibson girls gave way to more natural styles. There was conservative backlash against these women, as seen in some of the media at the time, that asserted progressive women advocated for suffrage and social change, were destroying the traditional family structure and leading American culture down a dangerous path. Mueller v. Oregon ruled a law that limited a woman's workday to 10 hours was constitutional. This ruling was both good and bad for women, as they were being exploited in the workforce. However, a limit like this may end up limiting employment opportunities. It is also important to mention some examples of muckraking women who investigated and wrote about social issues. Ida B. Wells traveled the South and reported on the horrific and widespread practice of lynching. And Ida Tarbell wrote a long-form expose on Rockefeller's Standard Oil. In it, she detailed Standard Oil's monopolistic practices and its involvement in political corruption. Towards the tail end of the Progressive era, the United States got involved in World War I. The war had an unintended effect of boosting opportunity for women and support for suffrage. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, working in a variety of areas, including producing needed war materials. However, this wartime opportunity was short-lived, as once the war was over, the men replaced the women in many of the heavy industrial fields. And a post-war recession eliminated a significant amount of jobs held by women. By the end of the Progressive Era, two major political victories were achieved. Slowly, the right to vote was achieved in individual states, especially west of the Mississippi River, but the passage of the 19th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for women across the country. Also, the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol passed. While not specifically a women's rights focus, it was a movement that was led by women for decades. So we covered a lot of topics in the Progressive Era, from muckrakers to fashion and amendments. It is worth taking a moment and to ask the question, did the era lead to significant social changes and a shifting of economic and political power to women? There are arguments on both sides. The yes side could point to political victories themselves, and that in the 1920s, a few females will gain prominence in other areas, like athletics and cinema, along with a few women elected to Congress, like Jeannette Rankin, and also the changes in women's fashion. However, others look at what follows and disagree, not because that great achievements were not made, or there was a lack of effort, but that the traditional roles of the cult of domesticity and separate spheres were strong social forces that could not be done away with, and the women who did gain prominence were few and far between. There was not a major shift in political or economic power, and further gains were not made in the 1920s or 30s. It will take until the 1960s and 70s for landmark legislation or court rulings like the Equal Pay Act, legalized birth control, and anti-discrimination laws to pass. Speaking of the 1920s, going back to the key concepts, 7.2 says, in the 1920s, cultural and political controversies emerged as Americans debated gender roles, modernism, science, religion, and issues related to race and immigration. A couple of examples that fit this concept are the Flappers, who are mostly middle and upper class city socialites. They challenged traditional norms with fashion and participation in nightlife, while traditionalists pushed back and emphasized, in their views, proper roles and customs for women. Jumping ahead a bit to World War II and key concept 7.3, similar to World War I, but even more pronounced, war mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their social-economic positions for the war's duration. And sticking with the same theme and concept, but with military service, it provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic position for the war's duration. Women joined the armed forces in record numbers, though not in combat roles. Most took clerical jobs in the various branches. Some were in support of combat troops. A couple of examples are the WAVES, or Women Accepted for Voluntary Service, and the WACs, or Women Army Auxiliary Corps. After World War II, women were again relegated to their separate sphere. The 1950s and early 60s were an era of conformity, with trends and forces like suburbanization, TV shows, magazines, and advertisements reinforcing the stereotypical image of the dutiful housewife. However, women's rights advocates both created influential works and organized to advocate for equal rights and opportunities. A couple of great examples to show this include Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and the National Organization for Women, or NOW. The advocacy for more opportunities and rights did help to result in important legal gains, including the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Supreme Court decision Griswold v. Connecticut, which legalized birth control for married couples, Title IX, which sought to bring equal opportunities in education, and the famous Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortions. Within individual states, divorce laws were loosened. However, the advocates for women's rights were halted on one specific item, and that was the Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment stated, "The equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." The movement was countered by conservative activist and author Phyllis Schlafly, who argued the amendment would hurt laws that are meant to protect women, like the exclusion of women from the military draft. The battle between liberals and conservatives was fierce, and it looked like liberals were going to win as the amendment passed Congress and was close to the 3/4 of state legislatures threshold. However, as a result of the Stop ERA movement, a few states rescinded their support, and it failed. Wrapping up our look at women's history, we have key concept 9.2, which states intense political and cultural debates continued over issues such as immigration policy, diversity, gender roles, and family structures. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the religious moral majority movement that tied itself to conservative Republican President Ronald Reagan emphasized family values and pushed back against liberal ideas and feminism. However, women's and liberal groups and politicians continued voicing their concerns in regards to inequality, treatment in the workplace, and representation in government. There have been gains and losses on both sides. But as we can see today, the tension between cultural conservatives and liberals is ongoing. Okay, that does it with the overview of women's history. I hope this helps you out for the upcoming AP exam. Subscribe to the channel for more upcoming AP exam review videos.